In its initial years, Resident Evil had always put the spotlight on an attractive duo facing off against a horde of monsters. But until 2002, it had implemented this scenario mechanically rather coyly. We had games with separate campaigns focusing on either character, or titles that switched you between characters mid-campaign. But in terms of gamifying a team-up between two survivors, the best we got is Resident Evil 2, letting you leave a few items behind for the other character's campaign, or Code Veronica letting you leave items behind in your item box for the other protagonist when the title changed perspectives. Though to say Code Veronica lets you do that is perhaps a misleading way to describe this scenario. It switches you between characters at surprise moments. You're not told in advance when these moments are going to be, and you're not told initially that the character the game switches you to is going to have access to items you've left in that item box. It ends up just being frustrating rather than an interesting challenge where the player has to weigh up what to give each character to use. But what if you could switch back and forth between each character on the fly at your discretion? What if you could hand items to your partner and send them out to complete a specific task on your terms? Today on Road to the Rocket Launcher, we look at the Resident Evil that took a chance on making that a reality. 2002's Resident Evil 0.
Resident Evil 0.
In this title, Resident Evil 1 support character, medic Rebecca Chambers, is caught in a deadly outbreak orchestrated by singing leech scientist James Marcus, who's revealed not just to be behind the first game's outbreak, but the creator of the monster-birthing T-virus. Umbrella leached off his research, so now he's gonna leech him back. Literally. To survive, Rebecca has to team up with ex-Marine convict Billy Cohen, who has serendipitously escaped in the chaos. The game carries over the basic formula from the previous Resident Evils. You're dropped into a map with a series of locked-off areas and have to explore to find the tools needed to access the inaccessible, while avoiding enemies that can deal hefty damage. Once in a while, you'll get bottlenecked into an event or boss fight that will be easier or harder, depending on how efficient you've been at conserving health and ammo throughout your exploring. The mix-up here is that you'll now have control of the two leads at once in the same game space. You can switch control between them whether they're in the same room or separated by the entire map. While playing as a character, you can instruct the other to follow you around, or to stay put so you can split up. If both characters are in the same room, you can use the right analog stick to move the second character around, which can come in handy if you want to back them away from an incoming enemy, or get them out of your way. If the characters are directly next to each other, they can also exchange items. The player is slowly eased into this setup in the first area of the game, the Elliptic Express. One of your characters will quickly end up locked on their own in a room. The character free to roam around the train will have to find an ice pick to get their partner out. A little service lift allows the two to share items between them, so you can send your ice pick to the trapped character when you find it, and the trapped character can send whatever is in the room down for the protag out on the hunt to use. Once the trapped character is freed, you'll run into a scenario where both characters are required at the same location. To get this grapple hook, one person will have to hit a button to release it while the other grabs it. It's hard to get too stuck on this train segment. It's a train, there's only really two directions to go in. There are a few spots to go up to a second floor, but they all lead up to isolated pockets. Two of these pockets do eventually connect when these eggs disappear, but that only happens right before you're already due to trigger the set piece that ends the train segment, so it's not of much use at that point. The segment can take up to an hour and a half if you're taking your time, or 45 minutes if you're going through it fast. So it takes a good while for the train segment to end and for the rest of the game to really open up. It's forgivable since I could see the dual character system being somewhat overwhelming if the game started with its more open mansion-esque level. This section, the training facility, kicks in after the train and begins much like the mansion in Resi 1 and its remake. A good chunk of items to pick up off the bat with a bunch of locked and unlocked doors to try. This is where the potential of the dual character system starts to show. You can opt to go everywhere with your partner, as you'll undeniably be stronger with two streams of bullets to take on foes with. With two characters on you though, your potential for taking damage also goes up. If any one character dies, the game is over. Alternatively, you can split up to be less of a target, but with lower damage output and smaller inventory. There is a cheeky benefit though to this that you'll soon discover. You can just keep one character in a save room while exploring with the other, and switch back to the one near the save to back up your progress whenever. As long as the other character isn't being threatened, you can save no matter where they are. One benefit to splitting up is that if one character is low on health and at risk of dying, you can leave them in a safe place and send a partner to complete a tricky task or scavenge for healing items. I like this because it gamifies surviving as a team really effectively. Scenarios where one character has to pick up the slack for the other will organically emerge when inevitably someone takes heavy damage. The game, through basic play, creates a sense like few others that its protagonist's greatest asset is their ability to cooperate. What undermines this dynamic, though, I think, is the way the game constantly forces both characters to reconvene, to open up new areas, solve puzzles, or grab certain items. Rather than demanding characters come together organically, these scenarios gate progression until you drag both characters into the same room. This happens so often that splitting up becomes heavily disincentivized, far more than I think it should have been. I feel that if both characters need to reconvene, it's much more interesting if it's a decision the player has to make. Is the scenario one character is facing too dire for them to do alone, and should I send backup rather than keep them separate? That's far more interesting than being forced to do it, to work some contrived lift that needs two people to operate it or something. Removing these forced points of reunion would also encourage skilled play, as players capable of keeping both characters in one piece while separated could more efficiently comb the level. Perhaps a savvy player could keep both characters apart and only have them reconvene when the level is over. You could argue these frequent forced meetups prevent the player from exploiting keeping one character next to a save point, but that could have easily been fixed by just disallowing saving unless both characters are in the same room together. On the flip side, an interesting decision is that except for the final 3 boss encounters, the title forces you to take on all the others with just one character. This means that for most of the game, there's rarely an enemy you're forced to take on as a team. This scenario, on the whole, is forced very rarely. I can see the benefit of this. You can move the other character with the second stick, granted, but with camera angles switching on you in confined areas, and the AI partner making decisions on their own when you choose not to move them manually, the risk of your game ending because your partner got killed could be frustrating if a team fight were forced onto you. The first 4 boss fights circumvent this issue by not making you fight them as a team, but the question perhaps then becomes, why does the game not give you the option to fight them as a duo if you want to? I suppose it makes balancing the game easier. At any point in the title, the player can have 2 fully healthy characters walking around with plenty of ammo, healing items, and the ability to shoot simultaneously. On the flip side, they could be out of healing items, low on ammo, and have one character made virtually unusable because they're on the brink of death. If the bosses in the game were balanced to be challenging with that first scenario in mind, they would probably be almost unbeatable if the player was currently dealing with that latter situation. So the bosses are made with a solo fight in mind, and the game prevents you from fighting them with both characters so they can't be steamrolled. One boss near the end of the game lets you choose whether to fight it either with one character or both, and the game still errs on the side of caution by making it a fight against a previous boss who had to be fought solo before. It makes for an easy fight if fought here with both characters in play. The final 2 bosses force you to fight them as a team so they can be balanced accordingly. On the subject of boss fights, there are some clumsy attempts in Resi 0 to go beyond the damage sponge, bottleneck design of classic Resi bosses. Rather than being a simple test of how well you've accrued resources up till that point, the Bat boss gives you all the ammo you're gonna need to beat it right before the fight, and instead wants to focus the challenge of the battle, supposedly, on a test of aiming skill and dexterity, which is not the strong suit of classic Resi combat controls. Resi 0 lets you snap to a target with the L button, so in a boss scenario like this, initially you think there'll be no problem. Aim up, hit L, snap to the bat, voila. Except the devs are one step ahead of you and send in a truckload of regular bats to swarm the room too. So now, who knows where the L button will snap you? The giant bat that can pick you up and drain your health while making you look like an idiot, or the tiny dudes that just peck away at you. It can feel like there's too much luck involved. Keep in mind, holding L doesn't keep you locked on to the enemy you snap to. It will move your aim to where the enemy is when you hit the button. But if the enemy then moves, you'll have to hit the button again to hopefully catch up. Sometimes you'll hit L and lock on to the big one, sometimes you won't and will end up praying you can cycle through snapping to the little guys fast enough so you can aim at the actual boss before it hits you hard. It's difficult to tell if you even have snapped to what you want though, because there's no lock-on reticule, which is fine for the rest of the game to keep things nice and HUDless, but if that's the look we're going for, perhaps it's not a good idea to have a boss about having to pick the right target amongst a dozen others. You can't even just get rid of all the small bats because more spawn in once you're done. Of course, this is also the kind of boss that you can just kill real quick if you can get him to bumble into the right corner early on and wail on him super fast, which I think only goes to show how sloppy the design of this encounter is. Quickly jank him to death in seconds, or dip into a hellish nightmare battle. Awesome. This is the kind of fight where I really wonder what I'm being tested on. Because here it's not resource management, it's not survival skill, and it's not even really combat prowess. It's outmaneuvering a mechanic poorly suited to the situation. One mechanic that gets binned off for the first time are the universal item boxes. Instead, the whole game is an item box. If you want it out of your inventory, just plonk it on the ground and it will remain there for the rest of the game. Unless you left it on the train, in which case at the end of that stage, it will get comedically thrown off into the next one. It feels good to be able to pick something up even if you have a full inventory by leaving something else behind that you can come back for later. On the flip side, you can't leave anything in a teleporting box to get it to the other side of the game world, so swings and roundabouts. It's not like they couldn't have done both, but if they had kept the item boxes, there would have been an interesting knock-on effect. Imagine playing something like RE Remake, but with two characters you can independently send wherever you want and can freely switch between. You could essentially keep one on one side of the map and the other on the other side of the map the whole time, trading items through the item boxes. There would be little need to devise strategies about how to get from one side of the map to the other safely when you could just switch to the character you have on the other side. You'd have to think less about how to get from one side of the mansion to the other safely if mind jumping between two-player characters was possible. Maybe Resi 0 wanted to prevent this kind of strategy from emerging, but why not let it emerge? Especially in a game like this one that asks the two characters to reconvene so much anyway, and mechanically doesn't really encourage thinking too hard about what route to take to get anywhere safely. Perhaps the devs thought it would be just too abstract of a mechanic to form a strategy around. Magically sharing items across the game space like this in what is supposed to be a grounded survival scenario where two people exchange tools and keys to escape. But why not just create some alternate context for item boxes? Like some kind of item transport device intended to deliver things around the installation you could use to share pickups around the stage. Well, the game does eventually do this, but as part of a curated scenario in the game's third major level, the laboratory. Here your two characters are separated and to progress, must share items back and forth across the divide through another service lift. It's a fun part because you have to weigh up who needs resources the most between two people, while also trying to figure out how to make progress by sharing keys back and forth. I like the little trick the game plays on you here by preying on your complacency. A dormant zombie will awake in the downstairs save room, leaving the character there vulnerable if you don't prepare or check back frequently. Once again though, Resi Zero isn't prepared to deliver on this scenario organically, which is perhaps a missed opportunity. What if there was no divide separating the characters, and again, the choice was left to the player about whether to keep them together or separate them to have each character near a service lift access? One thing I'll give the game is that the way the title is paced like this forces varied scenarios on you and does therefore keep the momentum up for longer than the average Resi, I think. Rather than starting strong with a compelling maze and fizzling out a bit later, Zero starts strong with the fresh train scenario, then has a more traditional maze-like mansion level, before switching to the lab segment where you must explore two separated areas simultaneously. You get a level where you're predominantly alone, then a level where you're predominantly together, and then a level where you're separated but have to switch back and forth. I would have preferred a more freeform structure, but you can see the logic to this arrangement. Unfortunately, I think there's no denying Zero has one of the most forgettable final areas in a Resident Evil game ever. An underground water treatment facility that caps the game off with a very slow block puzzle, and big frogs that show up at random to insta-kill you. Truly epic.
I'll go alone.
Roger.
It's probably important to recognize too that while the on-the-fly character switch allows you to create your own diverging points, or keep switching between two characters when the game asks you to split off, there are a few Code Veronica-esque moments where the game switches characters without warning and forces you to play as just one of them until you reconvene. After the lab, Billy will disappear, forcing you to play as Rebecca only for a bit. You'll lose access to anything Billy had on him till you find him again, and before you do, you'll at minimum have to face down a boss. Unlike Code Veronica, the game does go out of its way to make sure this moment is nowhere near as brutal. The split happens in basically the same room as a save point, unlike CV's major splits, the first of which happens after a boss fight. So in Zero, you can easily reload to rethink your approach if the split ruins you. But let's say you didn't save there, the game still offers you a loaded magnum the moment you split up, which alone is capable of killing the Rebecca-only boss that happens right after. There's also quite a lot of ammo lying around after the split, so unless you just didn't have Rebecca equipped with any firearm when the split happens, you should have plenty to survive to get back to Billy. If anything, the force split I have a bigger problem with is the other shorter one that happens earlier on in the game. You'll be asked to grab a key as Rebecca, at which point this giant centipede boss will drop down and capture her, forcing you to fight it as just Billy. This is much different because it's a lot more likely here that the player hasn't saved for a while, since this split happens in the middle of regular exploration, unlike the bigger split later, which happens as you attempt to leave a level. It's much more likely that a player would save before attempting to leave an entire stage than before this fight, which is much more of an interruption to your current business. But what's worse is that there's no get out of jail magnum just lying around here. You better hope you had Billy equipped with enough to tango and didn't give Rebecca everything, because if you did, the boss is probably gonna own you. It's not the biggest deal in the world, it's hard to imagine losing much progress, even in the worst case scenario, but I do wonder if this bit could have been done more gracefully. Even though they're much less egregious or frustrating than in CV, I do also have to wonder if we've devised an entire gameplay system in Zero around giving the player control over the type of scenario Code Veronica sucker punched the player with in such an aggravating way, why the devs would risk including moments, again, where a character is locked off from you by force and by surprise anyway here. While the game opens up after the train into a more typical Resi maze, unfortunately, it follows the more restrictive linear setup of something like the Resi 2 police station, more so than the mansion layout of 1 or its remake. While Resi 1's mansion remains pretty open throughout its duration, Resi 0's training facility funnels in as it goes on, but tries to obfuscate that a little. For example, there's a moment about halfway into the training facility where you'll use a floppy disk to unlock 3 doors. So you'll be thinking, awesome, that sounds like a lot of places to go rummage. But the reality is that only one of these doors is of consequence. Door 1 will lead you to a whole plethora of stuff, but door 2 will lead you out to an empty room with a key item you can't acquire without an item acquired on the path that door 1 leads to. And door 3 leads to another empty room where you'll eventually place 3 key items to leave the area. The point is, doors 2 and 3 might as well be open from the moment you arrive at the training facility, because having them open now makes no difference. Beyond the start, in the training facility, rarely do you have to pick between going to more than maybe at most 2 locations at any one time, which is a little disappointing. The removal of Crimson Heads also means there's less to think about. Let's say you're in the main hall and want to go to this underground area. There are 2 ways to get there, through the dining room or up around the back via the storage room. In Remake, there would be a choice to make here. If you had killed the zombies in the dining room, there would have been a threat of them returning as the more powerful Crimson Heads, so you might have chosen to take the long way around. Here though, you're just going to take the dining room route because zombies stay dead now. Now, in both the dining room and the storage room, the game will spawn in new enemies once you pass certain invisible progression markers, but you're going to have no idea what those are, so they're not going to factor into your approach, at least not on your first playthrough. One issue that looms large over the entire game is how the inventory management is handled, yet given the circumstances, it's hard to see how it could have been done any other way. Even though this game gives the player the highest degree of freedom in terms of how they manage their items, you can use and combine items off the ground now, just leave items on the ground, etc. Exchanging items back and forth between the 2 characters can just take a lot of time due to how you control the inventory menus. Making these choices of who to equip what with is compelling, but the process is cumbersome when you have to do so much of it with just a D-pad and 2 buttons. If you're leaving items on the ground and managing a huge collection that way, you'll have to wait for the menu to load in and out a lot. It's a pain. This is an issue, I think, with the input method we have here. I could imagine some kind of drag and drop mouse and keyboard interface, making quick item sorting far more intuitive. I know I'm more prone to saving in Zero, not so I can avoid redoing a boss or a tricky encounter, but because I'd rather not do any inventory management all over again. The lack of universal item boxes and the way inventory management works can result in one of the game's most maddening moments if you're thinking like a long-time Resi player. You see, once you clear out the training facility and kill the boss at the end of it, you'll probably assume it's time to leave the training facility behind for good to go to the smaller endgame areas. That's the usual flow prior Resi games have had. With no universal inventory here though, you'll then go, uh-oh, anything I want to take to the next area, I'm just going to have to carry with me over there. Since there's not going to be an item box in the next part of the game, I can just summon everything from. If you're being cautious on your first playthrough, this can easily lead to running back and forth between the training facility and the lab to get your items across. I mean, at minimum, you're probably going to have to go back for the grapple hook you haven't used since the train hours ago, now required here to access the lab level. If you do make multiple trips to move all your items to the lab though, you'll have egg on your face a couple hours later, when after the first tyrant fight, you find a lift that loops back around to the start of the training facility. Oops. Thing is, whether you looked at the map and took the leap to assume the red door next to where you crashed the train is in fact a shortcut back for later and not just some extra room you didn't check, the reality is you don't know when you're going to loop back, and if you're going to need a bunch of items shortly after the Bat Boss anyway. Even if there was a big arrow pointing at this door saying shortcut for later, who knows what you're going to need in the next area after the training facility. The inventory system here can't just be troublesome because you might be caught short at a boss or due to item management being cumbersome, but also because transporting much of what you can collect can be super time consuming and monotonous. And the game seems to know this too, because right before the final boss, the title dumps a crap ton of resources on you. It knows that with no easy way to transport stuff across the game world, the act of going back through the game at this point to find supplies for the final battle is just not something fun anyone is going to want to do. So by this point, the title just has to undermine its entire premise of being a hardcore survival game because its own rules this time have made that process too tedious. Sure, there's no magical teleporting item boxes now, but if getting rid of them has made resource management such a chore this time around, maybe their blanket removal wasn't such a great idea. Another big issue with Zero is that the training facility isn't too interesting at this point in the series. It's ultimately another mansion. This might have constituted a fun throwback to the original game, but Zero came out the same year as a full-on Resi 1 remake. Playing them back to back, the training facility, which is the biggest area of the game, loses a lot of its appeal. The RE1 remake was a throwback, but the mansion was also different enough from the originals to make it feel like a new take on the setting. Now we get another riff on that setting, and it's just not that exciting. We got both nostalgia and a new spin on the mansion-type level in Remake, and Zero's repeat prescription of that is rather dull. It's especially underwhelming when the train setting is so fresh but is about half as long. Being in a moving confined map is a really interesting scenario for the series, and while it would have been a stretch to keep the whole game on a train, I still think there's ways they could have kept this setting part of the game for longer. What if you gained control of the train and could move between a series of independent areas? Maybe you'd get off, explore, and then bring new knowledge or a tool back with you onto the train to take with you to other areas or to unlock new parts of the train itself. This could have also fixed the issue with having to carry items great distances, as you could have a stash on the train that moves with you from area to area. The lab and factory are already kind of connected by a train of their own, so why not have made this be how you explore the Arclay region? More contrived scenarios have been engineered for this series. Just make something up about how the leeches have broken the tracks that lead out of the area and boom, choo-choo, we're off. There's one aspect of the game, though, that makes it still, I think, a must-play for horror game fans, and that's the amazing presentation. RE0 is basically the last AAA game to implement the pre-rendered fixed camera style, and thus it's at its absolute peak here. The game looks incredible. Every room is bursting at the seams with detail. The fixed angles on these intricate backgrounds allow for a thick mood to be created with choice camera positioning and deliberate lighting. The way certain rooms are framed give them an otherworldly edge, even if there's nothing that abstract happening. Also this cut. Beautiful. Sound is also superb, from the comforting typewriter clicks and clacks of the menus to the ambient noises. It's a great world to just want to stand around and soak in. The environments do heavy lifting for a rather bland enemy lineup. Once again, Resident Evil here is happy to throw a virus onto an animal to make them bigger or angrier. So we get monkeys. The highlight are the leech monsters, of course, even though they lose much of their threatening presence in the rooms where you can comedically squish them. They turn into these enemies that essentially act as more threatening versions of the goofy, stretchy arm guys from CV. They hit hard and are initially quite unnerving to encounter, but they lose a lot of their impact as you progress. With leeches coming together to form these enemies, it would have been cool to see new different transformations as you went through the game. But the leeches take this same one form that comes with this same one music track, so their presence becomes repetitive. Resi Zero is a very pretty and a very mechanically intricate horror game, but not enough focus, I think, is placed on trying to unnerve the player. There aren't as many interesting tricks played on the gamer or surprises to encounter as past entries, unless you count the frogs, which I don't. The final boss has a macabre design, but the fight itself leaves something to be desired. You have to distract it until a cutscene plays where not only is there no rocket launcher, but you don't even get to fire the final shot in the game. The final shot in a Resi game is supposed to be a payoff that symbolizes how far you've come. That after everything you've been through, you've managed to reduce the biggest monster in the game to just another enemy that gets taken out with a press of the fire button. Every shot in the title is leading up to it. They do it for me here in a cutscene? How could they let this happen? Something that really undermines a lot of Resi Zero for me are some of the absolutely wild story decisions and missed opportunities. This game is a prequel to Resi 1 and veers wildly between being a standalone story new fans can enjoy and fan service lore dump. While the premise of Rebecca Chambers teaming up with a convict to fight the monster responsible for the T-Virus could have probably taken place after the original game far more easily, Zero sets it before Resi 1, and for the first half of the title, splices in these scenes of the villains from games 1 and 2, detailing their plans. Because of this, it's the first Resi to feel rather impersonal. It's one thing to fill in gaps or reference prior titles through notes or memos not pining for your attention, but periodically cutting back to these pre-rendered scenes our heroes aren't even privy to is too much. It ends up feeling like the series posturing as this expansive, intricate web of conspiracies and plot lines is now taking precedent over focusing on the journey of the heroes we're currently playing as. Then these scenes stop halfway through the game and the second half forgets all about them. The only real consequence they have for this story is that a character in them halfway into the game announces he's gonna self-destruct the facility you're in.
URC is equipped with a self-destruct device in the basement. I'll find it, set it off, and annihilate the place to nothing more than a massive rubble.
But conveniently, that process only begins when we're fighting the final boss about 3 or 4 hours later. As you might imagine, the notes and memos you find detailing mysterious past events are still the highlight of the story here for me. Don't even attempt to untangle how this series of events could possibly have taken place the day before RE1. Now, call me uninformed in the ways of search and rescue, but when Alpha Team got dispatched to find the missing Bravo Team at the start of Resi 1, I had assumed Bravo Team had gone missing maybe a few hours ago. If Resi 0 is to be believed, they waited a whole 24 hours after Bravo Team went dark before looking for the missing squad. Maybe Alpha Team were just pretty bad at looking. The search definitely wasn't immediate, since Zero confirms Wesker was out most of the night Bravo Team went missing. I guess it's possible the second Wesker leaves, they send out Alpha Team and Arclay is just so big it takes them that long to find the missing chopper. A bigger issue is that one of the reasons the Outbreak in 2 happens is that nobody will listen to the survivors from the incident in the first game because the mansion in that title explodes with all the evidence, as so happens does the facility in Zero. But hold the phone, because in Zero, Rebecca visits an area from Resi 2 which doesn't explode, because it's in Resi 2. Miss Chambers, could you not have attempted to find this place that didn't explode again? Maybe she thought it did, since the building next door does. Either way, something about this doesn't add up. Maybe the implication is that Rebecca died in RE1 because she actually can, and then she wouldn't be able to tell anyone about the installation that would later appear in Resi 2. But even at this point in the series, the premise of Zero had been teased in a memo in Resi 2 for the N64. In that memo, she covers up Billy surviving the events of Zero, presumably after surviving the events of 1. Also, doesn't William Birkin continue to work in this lab until around the time of Resi 2? What with tyrants and hunters on the loose just outside? Talk about a work environment. There's the issue of Rebecca being far less competent in the original Resi versus how she's portrayed in Zero, but I'm willing to give that one a pass since, according to Zero, she'd probably been awake 36 hours by the time 1 is happening. I'd be tired floundering about too.
Whoa! What is it?
What? Oh no!
Perhaps all this wouldn't be a problem if the core story with Rebecca and Billy was still compelling enough to overlook a few plot inconsistencies, but there are so many missed opportunities here. Let me just say that in concept, I really like the pairing in this game. A good girl cop and a bad boy criminal putting aside their differences to face a greater threat. Someone new to law enforcement and peacekeeping, more hopeful and perhaps naive, teaming up with someone on the other side, disillusioned and cynical. Just the image of a man in handcuffs and a policewoman teaming up to fight the unknown in the key art is striking. Imagine the kind of great chemistry these two could build over the course of an adventure like this. Well, you'll have to keep imagining, because they don't talk that much throughout the game. Outside of the start and end, they get very basic interactions. It's a real letdown. There's not much development between the two here. Billy was involved in horrific war crimes, and the game leaves the extent of his involvement slightly up in the air, leaning more towards him being innocent. As a result of these events, he has PTSD, something that also could have been interesting to explore, but this is barely touched upon too. Anyway, in conclusion, I think Resi Zero has some cool shakeups. At times, its new additions make for some tense, interesting gameplay, but at others, its changes serve to make a slow gameplay rhythm even more ponderous this time. For better and for worse, it doubles down on the slow, methodical nature of past Resis with some compelling results. But the adventure you go on, I think, fails to reward committing to these systems that could also do with a little breathing room. It's experimental enough to be fresh, it's polished enough to engross. But those experiments are kept on a tight leash, preventing the freshest inclusions from fundamentally elevating the series' traditional formula, and polish alone can't breathe new life into a lot of tired concepts and scenarios. The partner system is a novel feature placed on top of the basic RE formula, but that formula itself feels like too much of a retread in terms of structure and scenarios, and the partner system on top of it keeps being reined in too much to make up for that. So the game ends up lingering somewhere in the middle between innovation and iteration. It ends up as a solid horror outing with AAA spit and shine, but within the context of the series, it falls short of being up there as a classic like some of its predecessors. Next time on Road to the Rocket Launcher, the main series ditches this two-character playstyle for one character, and now one camera angle. The road will never be the same again. Tired of playing it safe, a bold new direction emerges. But how does it stack up against the body of work we've covered already? Tune in next time to find out.